Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. On today's episode, it's YouTubers interviewing YouTubers. We're here with Marcus from Reef Nerd. Let's check out his tank. All right, what happens when you get a couple of reefing YouTubers together? Well, first of all, we check out each other's filming equipment, which is kind of geeky, but then we're going to get onto the tank, so let's check it out. If you haven't heard of Marcus from Reef Nerd's YouTube channel, I highly recommend getting over there and subscribing. He's got a fantastic array of videos covering some really in-depth reviews of some new equipment and some different approaches to reefing. So do yourself a favor, get over there and subscribe. But for the time being, let's have a listen to how Marcus is going with his incredible Neptunian cube.
So it's a 3-foot Neptunian cube K90. Total system volume is about 300 litres, including the sump. Wow. So I think the tank is probably 250. So yeah, it's borderline too small for the amount of coral that I've got in it, because with this much coral sucking so much out of the water, it's impossible to keep this rock solid stable, because the daily swing is quite large just based on the amount of coral that's in there. But I think the corals do adapt. You don't need rock solid stability as long as your instability is stable, if that makes sense. You know, so if the daily swing is the same all the time, the corals adapt to that swing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's I guess what I've found, and not because I was aiming to have such a big swing. For reference, my daily swing on alkalinity can be as much as 1 DKH between the high point and the low point in 24 hours, and that repeats the next day. It's just the reality of this tank. As the peak of the day, the amount of consumption gets so high, and then at the low end of the day, like somewhere in the night, it gets so low that dosing the same amount consistently throughout the day leads to that kind of a swing.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Tell us about some of the other challenges or things you've overcome with the tank. Or I know we were talking before about how your equipment has started to infiltrate the house.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a gear junkie. This is not a simple tank, and my reefing methodology is certainly not simple. I'm running 3 different dosing systems, auto water changes, automatic ATO, and the latest addition, a calcium reactor. So let me give you the summary of how my tank works.
In the 250 litre display tank.
Yep. Yeah, so we'll start with filtration.
Sure.
I've got an undersized skimmer. It's a NIOS Quantum 120. I've got 1 filter sock, and I have an algae turf scrubber, which is that black box here, which is the Santa Monica Rain 2. That does the bulk of my nutrient export for the tank. So I could forget to turn my skimmer on for 2 weeks, and I don't think it would actually impact the tank at all. All it's really doing is oxygenating the water, trying to raise the pH. Same for the single filter sock. That's really doing nothing. It's just there to keep the water a little bit clearer, and I have it because I have it. Reactors, I'm running 1 reactor here, which is a resin reactor running the Blue Life Phosphate RX resin. And I got that because my phosphate was climbing a little bit at one point. The algae turf scrubber didn't seem like it was going to take up all of it. I think that might have been a phase because it came back down sort of quite rapidly. But I still run that reactor just for about 6 hours a day. I've got this reactor here, which is a CO2 scrubber, which is connected to the skimmer, again trying to raise pH. We're in an apartment in the city, so fresh air here isn't so fresh.
Sure.
So pH is a challenge of this tank. It's not an 8.3 pH tank. It's probably more of a 7.8, 7.9, which isn't really helped by the fact that I'm doing so much dosing as well, which has varying effects on the pH. So for dosing, we'll start with the big tall reactor at the back here. This is a calc stirrer, the Avast Marine K1 calc stirrer. That doses about 1.5 litres of calc water a day.
1.5 litres?
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's probably, in summer, that's most of my tank's evaporation. In winter, it's probably about half of it. And originally that was my only source of dosing. When there was a lot less coral in this tank and a lot less consumption, the kalkwasser met all the tank's demands. That soon changed, and so I had to supplement the kalkwasser with 2-part. And as you can see, I've got this fancy reservoir here for all of the dosing liquids. I didn't always have this. At one point, it was just jugs on the floor. But there's a core 7th up the top running the KH lab, which does alkalinity testing. And it is auto-controlling the 2-part dosing. When I say 2-part, it's actually 3-part. So we got magnesium, calcium, alkalinity. This is the reagent for the KH Labs testing, and this is Reef anabolics boron. And that was really good for most of the tank's life, and it's been primarily 2-part, playing a bigger and bigger role as the demands increased, and obviously I can't just keep dosing more kalkwasser. But it was getting to a point where we were dosing, I think at peak about 280 or 300 mil a day of each. So that's nearly close to a litre of 2-part being added to this tank, that's a lot of salt being added, so it's playing with the salinity. And also on top of the kalkwasser, I was dosing more than the tank could evaporate. So we had to find a better solution than just dosing more and more 2-part. So then we went to calcium reactor, which is the most recent addition. And right now the calcium reactor, I would say, is doing about 80% of the dosing. That's a Pacific Sun AC Mini with its CalcFeeder Pro control unit you can see on the back wall there. And that measures the CO2 saturation of the reactor to activate a solenoid on and off to add CO2 to the reactor, and it's got a dosing head built into it. So it controls the dosing at a set point, and that you manually set, and then keeps the saturation of the strength of the effluent at a set point through measuring the CO2 and turning that on and off. So yeah, the calcium reactor is doing about 80% of the dosing. Most of the rest is then taken up by a bit more 2-part and the kalkwasser as well. The goal is to wean the tank completely off 2-part. And eventually, once I dial it in and have the 2-part dosage so low that I can just turn it off, I'll then use these 3 free chambers to just dose saturated trace only. So I'll use probably Reef anabolics trace range and dose them at a set point but we'll see. We'll do some ICP testing and really see how much extra trace I need, because calcium reactor does contribute some. But that's actually something that really interests me, is finding out what trace elements are added by calcium reactors, because there's so little information on that out there currently. So yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of delving into that, and ICP testing will really help us do that.
Nice. Tell us about your auto water changes.
Yeah, so I was originally inspired to, back when I started the tank, try to build a water changeless tank. At the time, BRS was doing a lot about that in their videos, and people were talking about Triton. I didn't really know that at the time it wasn't very available in Australia. I know they are here in a big way now, but back then it wasn't. And the whole methodology of never having to do a water change was super appealing. But when then the reality came in with the tank, when it was new, it became apparent that water changes are necessary for a new tank, and you should never try to do a water changeless system with a new tank. I'd never recommend that for anyone. It's just going to create an algae bomb. So I was doing manual water changes, and like everyone, I didn't find them that enjoyable. Living in an apartment makes it even harder, because I don't have easy access to places where I can just dump large buckets of water like down an outside drain or something like that. Everything has to be sort of done within the confines of a kitchen sink. So I actually came across one of your videos, Sam, on talking about your auto water change system, and I thought, well, if I can automate water changes, that's just as good as having a water changeless system. It's because really what we hate about water changes is the manual labor associated with it. So if I take that away, then the goal of having a zero water change tank has been achieved anyway. Without the mad scientist complexity of really having to dial in trace element dosage and stuff like that, which you need to do with a true water changeless tank. So I was looking into liter meters because that's what you recommended. They're a little hard to source in Australia. And then I came across another solution which would work for a tank of my size, which was the the Auto Aqua Smart AWC Micro. I think that's its full name. It's got a pretty long name. No, Smart AWC Touch by Auto Aqua. And it also serves triple duty as ATO. So it's ATO and auto water change all in one. So there's 3 pumps. One is in the sump that takes water from the tank and is plumbed into my kitchen drain behind all this cabinetry behind here and into the drain. Another pump is in this reservoir here, which is my salt water storage. As you can see, it's about half full right now. 70 litres is about a bit over a month of salt water for me. And there's a tap on the back of this which is plumbed into my RODI unit. So refilling this is as simple as turning on a tap once a month, waiting for it to fill. There's a float valve in there, so no wet floors are going to happen. Once it's full, I know exactly how much salt to add to this. It's just a little bit over 2 kilos of salt. So I just have that measured out in baggies. This is not glued down or anything, so I just lift this up and I can dump the salt straight in. So really low maintenance to mix up new salt water. And then the third pump is in this 26 litre plastic tub, which is RODI, and that's for my freshwater top off. And this is self-filling. Again, I tried to build a DIY controller, or I didn't try, I did, I built a DIY controller. Originally I tried to do it based off the solid state relays, but they don't like me for some reason. So I went with what I know, which is computers. So I built a little Arduino one myself it's a bit overkill for the task of just turning on and off a tap basically on a solenoid, but you know, that was within my skill set, so that's what I did.
Realistic. If that's the only part of this that's overkill.
Yeah. But anyway, it fully automates. So when this gets empty, it refills automatically. And yeah, there's all fish stuff in here too. Salt and everything is in there. So it's a great unit. There's just 2 sensors in the sump, and it turns off the ATO when it's doing the water change. You set how many times a day you want it to do a water change, and the gap between the sensors is the high and the low mark. So I have it doing about a 3% water change once a day. And I can just as easily set that to do a 1% water change 3 times a day if I wanted to. So really solid unit. Eventually the little pumps it's the same pump that's used on all the smart micro ATOs out there. They're not going to last forever. Like, let's be real, they're a really small plastic pump. When they do break though, because they're just 12 volt, they're super easy to replace with anything. You could replace it with a peristaltic pump as long as it runs on 12 volt.
Tell us about one of your other distinguishing features on this tank in this beautiful Aquatic Life T5 LED hybrid fixture.
Yeah, so I was inspired to do the LED T5 hybrid again as a beginner reefer watching BRS videos. At the time, that was their big revelation, is that LEDs, if they aren't T5, they should act like T5, was I think what Ryan from BRS was saying a lot.
In terms of properly lighting a reef tank, if it isn't T5s, it should behave like T5s.
And I do believe that. I think he hit the nail on the head there. And so my LED journey is pretty well documented on my channel, but the gist of it was that I wanted something that would be able to provide coverage for a tank with the density of coral that I have, which means you need that wraparound light. And the only the only way to achieve that is to have light coming from multiple sources. So from the front, the back, and the middle, and the whole length of the tank. And T5s do that so well. But having started with LEDs, I started with a Illumagic Blaze X. The color that they provide is so much better than T5s, which when you see T5s alone on a tank, they look dull in comparison. So it was pretty obvious that the hybrid approach was going to be the winner. And we settled on 2 Kessel A360Xs because they just came out right around the time when I was doing this. And so let's go with the latest and greatest. And I've got the narrow beam reflectors on both of them, which I strongly recommend. I ran for about 3 months, one light with the narrow beam reflector and one without. And the growth on that half of the tank with the narrow beam reflector was significantly higher. So I just, if you don't need the spread, or you can compensate for the smaller spread by having more lights or something like that, definitely go with the narrow beam reflector. As for the T5 fixture itself, which is the Aquatic Life DX18, unfortunately it's still very difficult to get one in Australia. I had to import mine using a freight forwarder from BRS in America, which is not a cheap solution and not something that I'd necessarily recommend for anyone unless you really want the DX18. But the better solution would be for the Australian importers to start importing it and make it available to the Australian market. So if there's enough demand, I'm sure it'll happen. But it's a really nice unit. It's the fit and finish on this is a cut above their first generation hybrid. And I think they also do a version in white, which would look fantastic in a lot of people's homes as well.
Now tell us about some of the corals, fish, everything that we haven't covered yet.
Yep. So my blue tang and yellow tang are originals from day one on the tank. So as you can see, my blue tang's getting a bit big. He's still doing all right though. There's no stress indications from him, but I already have found a new home for him. I'm just waiting for that tank to finish cycling so that we can introduce him to a larger environment, which was always the plan in introducing a blue tang to this tank. The 2 clowns are both designer clowns, which are brought down from Queensland. So there's a photon, and then of course they go hiding as soon as I talk about them. But so we've got there's a photon, a snowflake photon, which is the larger female, and then the little male around the back here is a Picasso. And yeah, I really like my clowns. I'm waiting for them to pair up. They were very young when I got them, so they're still not the best of mates. They hide from each other, but eventually I'm sure they'll pair up. We've also got a 6-line wrasse in there who's a utilitarian fish purely to go and eat nasties. And for the most part, I think he does a pretty good job. And my 2 favorite fish are the mandarin pair that I have in here. They're the green mandarins. One's back there by the big leather. I don't know where the other one is, but I got a pair. So there's a male and a female, which is really cool. Down around here, you'll get him real easy. Yes, I can see. And they've done amazingly well in my tank. I'm not a believer in mandarins that are supposedly trained to eat pellets. It's just not how these fish work. If they do eat pellets, that's great, but you're providing probably 5% of their diet in the way that they work. They need to graze all day, every day. So don't add mandarins to a tank that doesn't have a healthy pod population. Easiest way to have a healthy pod population is have lots of live rock and run a refugium or an algae scrubber or a big ball of Kato or something like that, and your tank will be full of pods and be able to support mandarins. And if you can get a mated pair, it's really cool because every evening they do sort of a dance and they swim in a helix up and then separate and swim in a helix around each other, up and separate. And so yeah, they're really cool fish to watch.
So Marcus, how old's the tank?
1 year and 9 months old at this point.
1 year and 9 months old.
Yep. So obviously when we get to 2 years, there'll be a big update like I did when it got to 1 year.
Yep.
And so looking forward to that because I do have month-on-month progression shots of the tank.
Yeah, nice.
So I can do the morphing time lapse of showing the growth every month for 2 years, which I'll be looking forward to do. But the rate that things have changed on this tank, I think some people won't believe the difference between certain months.
Yeah,
because it's not just like moving coral around, which I haven't done that much, but just certain corals at certain times just exploded. So they go from nothing to a huge frag like in a month, which is really cool to see. And overall in the journey, you know, everyone has losses, like certain corals have done really well and others haven't. For me, you won't find much chalice in my tank. It just doesn't do well. It always seems to do okay for a couple of weeks and then slowly start receding and dying. And I'm not going to chase numbers on the tank off some theory as to why chalice in particular isn't doing well, because everything else is doing well. So I think if 90% of your tank is doing great, stick with the 90% and avoid that 10%, or try that again in a future date.
Definitely.
But yeah, overall, the goal of this tank has been psychedelic disco mixed reef. I want all the colors, as bright as possible, and as many different types of coral as possible. And I think a lot of people think that mixed reef is the hardest type of tank, and I probably wouldn't disagree with them, but it's certainly possible, it's certainly doable.
Absolutely. I mean, looking at some of the species you've got here, you've got an incredible array of zoas, you've got awesome acan garden, you've got Trichophilia, you've got Cynarias, you've got Scollies, you've got torches, I think we've already touched on the hammers, you've got sun corals, you've got elegants, you've got Goniopora, you've got the Igdeshi, we've got Digis, Acros, Pokies, Montes.
There's 2 clams in there as well.
2 clams. Tell us about the lengths you have to go to for some of these corals to grow so close to each other.
Yeah, so coral warfare is a thing, definitely. And I have a very solid understanding of each of the corals in my tank through trial and error mostly, of who's the aggressive one, who beats who. And I have had to move corals around where they're going to be too aggressive to their less aggressive, but maybe more desirable neighbor. And so we're at a point now where everything's sort of getting along, or at least where the slower growing one is the more aggressive one compared to its neighbor, with a couple of little exceptions. But yeah, bonsaiing and trimming certain corals is just a fact of life when you choose to have coral density as high as mine. On the plus side though, given that everything's growing so fast and I am having to do so much trimming, my frag rack's full.
Just coming into pan now, you can see the frag rack's absolutely full.
Yeah.
Touching on, you find the forest fire digi used to grow ridiculously quick.
Yeah, so actually I got the forest fire digi very early on in the tank's journey, and back then a frag of forest fire like this big was probably $150 or something. I think the price has come down a bit these days, but I glued it on the top of this rock structure here at the time, and the blue tang knocked it off one night. And at the time I also had gonies down around the bottom, and it fell into the goni and got totally stung. And there was probably about 3 millimeters of live flesh left on that frag that I paid $150 for. And when I cut the dead parts off that frag to then glue that 3 millimeters onto a frag plug, that 3 millimeters itself cut in half. So I had 2 like 1.5 millimeter micro frags of red forest fire digi on 2 frag plugs on this frag rack. And that was about 9 months ago. And that's what I have today. These 2 large colonies from a millimeter of red digi. So in my tank at least, it grows like a weed. Yeah, well, those frags are all off these 2. Yeah, so in my tank, red digi grows so fast. But yeah, I'm glad that I did save that 2 millimeters of little living flesh from the accident, because yeah, now I've obviously got heaps of it. I've got some nice zoas growing as well. My big zoa rock with the clam on it here is overgrown, so I've got a second zoa area on the main rock structure here, and some other ones up on my frag rack that I'm waiting to grow out a bit. The sun coral has got its polyps out at the moment, which is nice.
Yeah, just to give you the full round of
NPS.
LPS, SBS and NPS.
Yeah.
True mixed reef.
Yeah. It isn't growing. I wouldn't say the sun coral's got any new heads since I got it, but it's not shrinking either. So
That's about as healthy as a sun coral will look in a tank during the light hours, that's for sure.
Yeah. So as long as it's I'd say it's surviving. It's not shrinking, which is, I guess, the goal. Favorite coral's probably this acan. At one point, I thought I was going to lose that acan because I found a boring clam in its skeleton. So I lost about 4 heads off one side of it, and I couldn't. I was very distraught because it's my favorite acan. So I pulled it out of the tank, found that boring clam in the base, and cut that part of the coral off. Cut away all of the skeleton that was infused with the boring clam. And since then, this acan has come back with a vengeance, and it's probably doubled in size since then.
Looks amazing.
So if you ever have unexplained deaths on an otherwise healthy acan colony, check the base and the skeleton for boring clams.
Little buggers.
Yeah.
Nice one. What about your YouTube channel? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've really enjoyed the YouTube experience, and the channel's now about 1,200 subscribers, so we're doing pretty well, considering that I think I've only had it for 9 months now, or coming up on a year. Originally it started because there was a single head dosing pump was my first video review on a Coral Box cheap dosing pump, and they were doing a promotion where if you made a review on it, you'd get a discount or something like that. So I was like, okay, I was going to buy it anyway, so I may as well make a YouTube channel. And I really enjoyed filming the video, editing it, and posting it. And so then I just kept making videos, and it turned into a thing that I really enjoyed, and sort of expanded the hobby for me almost. It's a good way to interact with the community. A lot of people that you otherwise wouldn't meet might reach out to you, and if you don't mind being on camera, or you don't mind talking about something you're passionate about, then it's a really good outlet. I also found that the American YouTube channels weren't sort of giving me what I wanted. I mean, we all watch BRS TV, but it's a very formal type of experience on reefing, and it's very much focused around their business, which is their warehouse of all the stock that exists in America, a lot of which we can't get here anyway. And I think having something more dedicated to the Australian reef scene, which I guess a lot of us, like yourself, first-time reefer David, the two gay reefers Gordon and Darren, the Cam and Anya from Gallery Aquatica, and anyone else, Sam Parker's Reef. You know, the Australian reef scene is really booming in the last year. So I think I sort of joined at the right time, and with the events that are being organised and the community around it, and the having Australian faces and Australian tanks get some sort of online exposure and notoriety within the scene, both within Australia and internationally, is only going to benefit the hobby. So whilst I'm really enjoying it personally and enjoying growing my channel and sharing the journey of my tank, I'd also encourage anyone else, if you think you can do it too, you absolutely should. And the more people that start building an online presence, the more of a community we can build around Australian YouTubers and the reef scene.
All right, we're going to wrap things up there with reef nerd Marcus. Thank you so much for taking the time to show us through your tank, your equipment, your methodologies, and just all things about how you approach reefing. It was an absolute pleasure to come and visit you, and I really look forward to having you and your partner down to check out my tank. That's all we've got time for today, viewers. I hope you really liked the interview. If you've got any questions for Marcus, pop them in the questions down below. Also, make sure you jump over to the Reef Nerd YouTube channel. He's got some incredible content there. Till next time, guys, if you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. Thanks again. Bye.